The shovel struck earth as Marcus planted his late mother's roses in his own backyard. Across the fence, Helen Thornfield's eyes narrowed with vindictive satisfaction as she dialed 911. "I'm reporting illegal activity," she hissed into the phone. "Destruction of property, trespassing, maybe drugs." What she didn't know was that the sheriff's cruiser pulling up belonged to Marcus's brother, and 20 years of her reign of terror was about to end. Some neighbors call the cops. Others are the cops. Part 1. The Garden of Wrath. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as Marcus Rivera knelt beside the freshly turned soil in his backyard. His hands, still trembling slightly from the emotion of the past week, carefully lifted his mother's prized rose bush from its temporary pot. The Queen Elizabeth rose had been Maria Rivera's pride for 30 years, surviving 3 moves and countless storms. Now, a week after her funeral, it would find its final home in the garden she'd never see completed. "Easy, Mama," Marcus whispered, his voice catching. "You're going to love it here." The soil was rich and dark, prepared with the same meticulous care his mother had taught him as a boy. He'd spent the previous evening mixing compost and peat moss, creating the perfect bed for the roses that had meant everything to her. The backyard of his modest 2-story home was finally ready to become the sanctuary she dreamed of, a place where her memory could bloom eternal. As he gently positioned the root ball, Marcus felt a familiar prickle on the back of his neck. He didn't need to look up to know that Helen Thornfield was watching from her immaculate lawn next door, her pale blue eyes scanning his every movement with the intensity of a surveillance camera. The woman had made his life miserable for the 6 months since he'd moved to this quiet suburban neighborhood, filing noise complaints when he mowed his lawn, calling the city about his unkempt driveway, and lecturing him about property values. Whenever their paths crossed, Helen Thornfield was 72 years old and had ruled Maple Street with an iron fist for nearly 4 decades. Her own yard was a testament to obsessive control, every blade of grass precisely trimmed, every flower bed bordered with military precision, every tree pruned to within an inch of its life. She'd driven away 3 previous neighbors from Marcus's house, each family eventually selling rather than endure her constant harassment. But Marcus wasn't going anywhere. This house, with its peeling paint and overgrown garden, was where he'd chosen to start over after his divorce. This was where he'd cared for his mother in her final months, where she'd sat on the back porch planning the garden they'd planned together when she felt better. The cancer had taken her before she could see a single rose bloom, but Marcus would make sure her vision lived on. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The sharp voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Marcus looked up to see Helen standing at the chain-link fence that separated their properties, her silver hair pulled back in its usual severe bun, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. She wore a pristine white cardigan despite the October chill, and her manicured hands gripped the fence with the fervor of someone ready for battle. "Good morning, Mrs. Thornfield," Marcus said, forcing politeness into his voice. "I'm planting my mother's roses." "On whose property?" she demanded, her voice rising to a pitch that could shatter glass. Marcus blinked, confused. "On my property. In my backyard." "That's what you think." Helen's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "I've had this neighborhood surveyed twice in the past 5 years. That fence is 6 inches onto my land. Everything you're planting is on my property." The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stood slowly, soil still clinging to his hands, and stared at the woman who had made his grief-stricken months even more unbearable. "Mrs. Thornfield, this fence has been here for 20 years. The previous owners were trespassers, just like you." She pulled out her smartphone with the flourish of someone drawing a weapon. "I'm calling the police. What you're doing is destruction of property, and I won't stand for it." Marcus felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack. "These are my mother's roses. She died last week. I'm not destroying anything. I'm creating something beautiful." "Your sob story doesn't give you the right to trespass," Helen snapped, already dialing. "Maybe you people don't understand property rights where you come from, but this is America. We follow the law here." The barely veiled racism in her tone made Marcus's jaw clench. He'd heard variations of this theme from Helen before, subtle comments about people like him and maintaining neighborhood standards that left no doubt about her true feelings. But today, with his mother's roses literally in his hands and his grief still raw, her cruelty felt like a desecration. "Mrs. Thornfield, please," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Can't we discuss this like reasonable adults?" There's nothing to discuss. Helen held up her phone triumphantly as the call connected. 911. Yes, I need to report illegal activity on Maple Street. A man is destroying property and trespassing on my land. She paused, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. He appears to be Hispanic and is acting very aggressively. I'm concerned for my safety. Marcus felt the world tilt. The lie was so blatant, so calculated, that it took his breath away. He stood completely still, his hands visible, his voice calm throughout their exchange. Yet this woman was painting him as a dangerous criminal to emergency dispatchers, weaponizing his ethnicity and the implicit bias she knew would color their response. My address is 1247 Maple Street, Helen continued into the phone, her voice taking on a trembling quality that suggested terror rather than vindictive satisfaction. Please hurry. He's getting more agitated. Marcus realized with crystal clarity that this moment would define everything that came next. He could retreat, abandon his mother's roses, and let Helen Thornfield claim another victory in her decades-long campaign of neighborhood terror. Or he could stand his ground and face whatever consequences her lies might bring. The rose bush in his hands seemed to pulse with warmth, as if his mother's spirit was offering strength. Maria Rivera had faced down discrimination and hatred her entire life, working double shifts as a nurse to support her 3 children after their father died. She'd never back down from a fight when principle was at stake, never let bullies win without a struggle. I'm not going anywhere, Marcus said quietly, returning to his knees beside the half-planted rose. These flowers belong here, and so do I. Helen's face contorted with rage. Did you hear that? She said into the phone. He's refusing to leave. He's becoming violent. Send someone immediately. As Marcus continued planting, his movements deliberate and careful, Helen began providing a running commentary to the dispatcher that transformed his peaceful gardening into a criminal rampage. According to her breathless narrative, he was wielding the shovel as a weapon, had threatened her with bodily harm, and was clearly under the influence of drugs or alcohol. The lies piled upon each other like autumn leaves, each one more outrageous than the last. But Marcus had learned something important in his 43 years. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep the lies tried to bury it. And sometimes, justice came from the most unexpected sources. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Marcus pressed the last of the soil around his mother's rose and whispered a prayer in Spanish, the same one Maria had taught him as a child. As the sirens grew louder, he stood and dusted off his hands, facing whatever storm Helen Thornfield had summoned with the quiet dignity his mother had modeled every day of her life. The first police cruiser rounded the corner onto Maple Street, its red and blue lights painting the peaceful suburban morning in urgent colors. But as the vehicle drew closer, Marcus noticed something that made his heart skip: the sheriff's department. Insignia on the door, not the city police Helen had expected. And behind the wheel, wearing the tan uniform and badge of the county sheriff's office, sat a face Marcus knew better than his own, his younger brother David, whose weekend patrol route apparently included the very neighborhood where Marcus had chosen to make his stand. The irony was so perfect it felt like divine intervention. Helen Thornfield, in her desperate attempt to destroy him, had summoned the one person in law enforcement who would see through her lies without question. The woman who had spent 20 years terrorizing neighbors and manipulating the system was about to face the consequences of her own vindictive nature. As David's cruiser pulled to a stop in front of the house, Marcus caught his brother's eye through the windshield. David's expression shifted from professional alertness to confused recognition, then to something that looked remarkably like anticipation. Sheriff David Rivera stepped out of his patrol car with the measured movements of a man who had responded to thousands of domestic calls, but none quite like this one. At 38, he was 5 years younger than Marcus and had inherited their mother's sharp eyes and their father's steady presence. The gold star on his chest caught the morning light as he adjusted his duty belt, his gaze moving between his brother, who stood with quiet dignity beside a freshly planted rose bush, and the woman across the fence who was practically vibrating with vindictive energy. David said, his voice carrying the professional neutrality that had served him well through 15 years in law enforcement. I'm Sheriff Rivera. I understand you called about a disturbance. Helen Thornfield's face lit up with the satisfaction of someone who believed cavalry had arrived. She hurried to the fence line, her white cardigan fluttering like a surrender flag, though surrender was the last thing on her mind. Thank God you're here, Sheriff, she gushed, her voice taking on the trembling quality she'd used on the phone. "This man has been terrorizing me all morning. He's trespassing on my property, destroying my landscaping, and when I tried to reason with him, he became violent and threatening." David's expression remained neutral, but Marcus caught the slight, tightening around his brother's eyes, a tell he'd known since childhood. David was cataloguing inconsistencies, and Helen had already provided several. "I see," David said, pulling out his notepad. "And you are?" "Helen Thornfield. I've lived at 1249 Maple Street for 37 years. I'm a pillar of this community. Sheriff. I volunteer at the library, I'm treasurer of the Neighborhood Watch, and I've never had a single complaint against me." She gestured dramatically toward Marcus. "But ever since he moved in, there's been nothing but trouble. Loud music, unsavory visitors, and now this, blatant trespassing and destruction of property." Marcus felt his jaw clench at the casual lies, but he remained silent. He knew his brother's methods, had watched David navigate family disputes with the same methodical approach since they were teenagers. Let Helen dig her own grave with words. "Mr." David turned to Marcus, pen poised over his notepad as if he didn't know his own brother's name. "Rivera. Marcus Rivera." Marcus kept his voice level, professional. "I live at 1247 Maple Street, and I was planting my mother's roses in my own backyard when Mrs. Thornfield began making accusations." "Your mother's roses," David repeated, and Marcus caught the slight softening in his brother's tone, barely perceptible to anyone who hadn't shared a lifetime of memories with him. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Marcus said simply. Helen's eyes darted between the two men, and something in their exchange seemed to trigger an alarm in her paranoid mind. "Wait just a minute," she said, her voice rising. "Rivera. Ah, you two related? Because if you are, this is a conflict of interest. I demand a different officer." David looked up from his notepad, his expression mildly curious. "What makes you think we might be related?" "The name, obviously. And you're both." She gestured vaguely, searching for words that wouldn't sound overtly racist. "You people all stick together. I want someone impartial." The casual bigotry hung in the air like smoke from a garbage fire. David's pen stopped moving, and when he looked up, his eyes had gone cold. "You people, His voice remained professionally neutral, but Marcus recognized the dangerous quiet that meant their mother's temper was stirring in his younger brother. Helen seemed to realize she'd stepped in something ugly. "I didn't mean. I just meant that people from the same background might have bias. It's only natural." "I see." David made a note. "Well, Mrs. Thornfield, whether Officer Rivera and I share the same background or not, I can assure you I'll conduct a thorough and impartial investigation. Now, you mentioned trespassing. Can you show me exactly where this alleged trespassing occurred?" Helen practically preened at the question. This was a moment of triumph, the culmination of months of planning. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her cardigan pocket with the flourish of a magician revealing the ace of spades. "I had this property surveyed 6 months ago," she announced. "This fence is 6 inches onto my land. Everything he's planted is on my property, making him a trespasser and a vandal." She handed the document to David with shaking hands, not from fear, Marcus realized, but from excitement. This woman lived for moments like these, when she could destroy someone's peace with the weapon of false authority. David unfolded the paper and studied it carefully. The silence stretched for nearly a minute, broken only by the distant sound of a lawnmower and Helen's increasingly agitated breathing. "This is interesting," David said finally. "Mrs. Thornfield, are you sure this is the survey you want to rely on?" Something in his tone made Helen's confidence flicker. "Of course I'm sure. I paid good money for that survey. It clearly shows that this fence has been in its current location for over 20 years, David interrupted gently. "And according to state law, that makes it the legal property line regardless of where it was originally supposed to be placed. It's called adverse possession, and it's been settled case law for decades." The color drained from Helen's face. That's not possible. My survey clearly states, your survey states the original property lines as recorded in 1987. But this note at the bottom, which I suspect you didn't read carefully, explains that the fence has been in place since 1989, making it the legal Boundary. David looked up from the paper, his expression patient but firm. Mr. Rivera is planting roses on his own property. Marcus felt a surge of vindication, but it was nothing compared to the rage building in Helen's eyes. She'd been outmaneuvered by her own weapon, and the realization was clearly devastating. "You're lying," she snarled, her careful facade crumbling. "You're both in on this. This is corruption, conspiracy. I'm going to need you to lower your voice," David said, his tone sharpening. "Making false accusations against a law enforcement officer is a serious matter." But Helen was beyond reason now, her 37 years of neighborhood tyranny threatened by the simple application of actual law. "I know what this is," she spat. "This is how you people operate. You move into decent neighborhoods and destroy them from the inside. Well, I won't stand for it." She turned to Marcus, her eyes blazing with decades of accumulated hatred. "You think you've won something here? You think planting your weeds in my neighborhood makes you belong? You'll never belong here. Never." The mask was completely off now, revealing the poisonous core that had driven her campaign of harassment. But instead of feeling wounded by her venom, Marcus felt something unexpected: pity. Here was a woman so consumed by hatred that she'd constructed an entire identity around it, and now that identity was crashing down around her. "Mrs. Thornfield," David said, his voice carrying a warning, "I think you should go inside and calm down." "Don't you dare tell me what to do," Helen whirled on him. "I pay your salary. I vote in this county. And I will not be intimidated by a couple of criminals hiding behind a badge." The word criminals seemed to echo in the morning air. David closed his notepad slowly, and Marcus recognized the deliberate movement. His brother had heard enough. "Mrs. Thornfield, you've made several serious allegations this morning," David said, his voice taking on the formal cadence of official business. "You've accused Mr. Rivera of trespassing, destruction of property, threatening behavior, and drug use. You've also suggested that I would participate in corruption and conspiracy. These are all matters of public record now, and they'll all need to be investigated thoroughly." Helen's expression shifted from rage to confusion. "What do you mean? Investigated?" "I mean I'll need to interview your neighbors about your claims. Mrs. Patterson at 12:51, the Johnsons at 12:43, the Martinez family at 12:39. I'll need to ask them about the loud music, the unsavory visitors, the threatening behavior you've described. I'll also need to file a report about your accusations of police corruption, which will trigger an internal affairs review." The blood drained from Helen's face as the implications became clear. Her neighbors, the same people she'd terrorized, 4 decades with noise complaints and property disputes, would be asked to corroborate her story. The thought of those conversations clearly terrified her more than any threat Marcus could have made. "Now wait just a minute," she stammered. I might have exaggerated some things. It's possible I was mistaken about. Making false reports to law enforcement is a misdemeanor offense in this county," David continued relentlessly. "Filing a false police report, providing false information to a peace officer, misuse of emergency services, each one carries a fine of up to $2,000 and possible jail time." Helen clutched her chest as if she was having a heart attack. "You can't be serious. I'm a senior citizen. I'm a pillar of the community. I was just trying to protect my property by lying about drug use, violence, and trespassing." David's voice was ice cold now. "Mrs. Thornfield, I've been a peace officer for 15 years. I've seen real domestic violence, real property destruction, real threatening behavior. What I see here is a man grieving his mother by planting roses in his own backyard, and a neighbor who called 911 with a false emergency because she doesn't like the color of his skin." The accusatio. Helen Thornfield stood frozen at her fence line, her perfectly manicured world crumbling around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. The morning sun, which had seemed so bright with promise when she'd first spotted Marcus in his garden, now felt harsh and exposing. Her neighbors were beginning to emerge from their houses, drawn by the flashing lights of the sheriff's cruiser and the raised voices that had shattered the suburban tranquility. Mrs. Patterson from 12:51 appeared, on her front porch in a faded bathrobe, her grey hair in curlers. The Johnson family from 12:43 gathered at their living room window, 3 faces pressed against the glass like spectators at a zoo. Most damning of all, Elena Martinez from 1239 stepped onto her lawn with her arms crossed, her expression one of barely contained satisfaction. Helen noticed them all, and the weight of their collective gaze made her legs weak. These were the same neighbors she'd tormented for years with petty complaints and passive-aggressive warfare. The same people she'd reported for everything from children's birthday parties being too loud to Christmas decorations being garish and inappropriate. Now they were witnessing her public humiliation, and their barely concealed pleasure was obvious. "Sheriff Rivera," she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality that would have been pathetic if it wasn't so calculated. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately? I'm sure we can reach some kind of understanding without involving everyone." She gestured vaguely at the growing audience, but David shook his head. "You made this a public matter when you called 911 and made false accusations. The incident is already on record." Marcus watched his brother work with professional admiration. David had always been the diplomat in their family, the one who could diffuse their mother's temper or talk their way out of trouble with teachers. But there was steel beneath the velvet glove, a core of absolute integrity that their father had instilled in all three Rivera children. "However," David continued, "I am willing to consider the circumstances. Mrs. Thornfield, how long did you say you've lived in this neighborhood?" 37 years, Helen replied, clutching at this apparent lifeline. "I've been a model citizen, a pillar of the community, and in those 37 years, how many times would you estimate you've called the police on your neighbors?" The question hit Helen like a slap. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, as she tried to calculate the damage of an honest answer. Marcus could see her mind racing, trying to find a response that wouldn't further incriminate her. That's not relevant to today's situation," she finally managed. "Actually, it's very relevant," David said, pulling out his phone. "Because all those calls are on record. Every noise complaint, every property dispute, every suspicious activity report. The department keeps detailed logs, Mrs. Thornfield, and I'm looking at yours right now." He scrolled through his screen with the deliberate pace of a man who had all day. "Let's see. Complaint against 1247 Maple Street on June 15th for loud music at 3 p.m. on a Saturday. Complaint on July 2nd for suspicious visitors who turned out to be Mr. Rivera's family helping him move in. August 8th, another noise complaint for the sound of a lawnmower at 10 a.m. September 12th, complaint about offensive odors that were later determined to be barbecue smoke from a family gathering." Each entry hit Helen like a physical blow. The catalogue of her petty tyranny, laid bare in official language, sounded even more pathetic than Marcus had imagined. "Shall I continue?" David asked mildly, because the list goes back quite a bit further than Mr. Rivera's residency. Mrs. Patterson, the Johnsons, the Martinez family, the Hendersons who used to live at 1241, the Kowalskis who lived at 1245. You've filed complaints against every family on this block, haven't you, Mrs. Thornfield? Elena Martinez chose that moment to approach the fence, her expression one of barely restrained fury. She was a small woman in her 50s, but she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had endured much and survived it all. "Excuse me, Sheriff," Elena said, her slight accent making her words more pointed. "I couldn't help but overhear. Are you talking about Mrs. Thornfield's complaints?" "Elena, don't," Helen said quickly, panic creeping into her voice. "There's no need to." "Oh, but there is," Elena interrupted, her dark eyes flashing. "Because this woman has made our lives hell for 20 years. 20 years of complaints about our children playing in our own yard. 20 years of calling the city about our fence, our trees, our cars. She called the police on my husband for working on his truck in our own driveway, said he looked suspicious and might be stealing parts." "That's enough," Helen snapped, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "No, it's not enough," Elena continued, her voice rising. "She called Child Protective Services on us twice, claiming we were neglecting our children because they played outside. She tried to get our dog taken away, saying it was menacing when it was a 10-pound chihuahua. She made my daughter cry by telling her that our Christmas decorations were an eyesore that brought down property values." The words poured out like water from a broken dam. 20 years of accumulated grievances finally given voice. Marcus felt a deep sadness for Elena, for all the neighbors who had suffered Helen's campaign of harassment in silence, afraid that speaking out would only make things worse. "Mrs. Martinez," David said gently, "I appreciate your input, But she ruined the Hendersons' marriage, Elena continued, her voice cracking with emotion. Called the police so many times about their teenage son's friends that the boy became depressed, started acting out. They ended up divorcing because of the stress. She drove the Kowalskis away too. They sold their house at a loss just to escape her. Helen's face had gone ashen. The catalogue of her victims, spoken aloud in front of a law enforcement officer, painted a picture of systematic harassment that bordered on criminal behavior. That's all exaggeration, Helen stammered. I was just trying to maintain community standards. Mrs. Patterson had apparently heard enough from her porch and was shuffling over in her slippers and bathrobe. Helen Thornfield, you've been the scourge of this neighborhood for 40 years. You tried to get my late husband arrested for building a garden shed without asking your permission first. You called the fire department claiming we were burning trash when we were having a small memorial service for him in our backyard. I was within my rights, Helen began. You were within your rights to torture grieving neighbors. Mrs. Patterson's voice shook with indignation. You're a miserable, vindictive woman who's made everyone around you miserable too. David held up his hand for silence, and the remarkable thing was that everyone, neighbors and Helen alike, immediately complied. There was something about his quiet authority that demanded respect. Mrs. Thornfield, he said, his voice taking on the formal tone of official business, based on what I've observed this morning and the pattern of behavior described by your neighbors, I have reasonable cause to believe you've been filing false reports with the intent to harass. That's a misdemeanor offense under state law. Helen swayed on her feet as if she might faint. You can't be serious. I'm an elderly woman. I'm a victim here. Age doesn't exempt you from the law. And the only victim I see is Mr. Rivera, who was trying to honor his late mother by planting roses when you called 911 with false accusations of violence and drug use. The mention of his mother sent a spike of renewed grief through Marcus. In all the drama of the morning, he'd almost forgotten why he was here, to create something beautiful in memory of the woman who had taught him that dignity and grace could triumph over hatred and ignorance. However, David continued, and Helen's head snapped up like a drowning woman hearing about a life preserver, I'm prepared to resolve this matter without filing charges, under certain conditions. Anything, Helen said quickly. Whatever you want. First, you will apologize to Mr. Rivera for the false accusations you made this morning. A sincere apology, acknowledging that your behavior was wrong. Helen's face contorted as if she was being asked to swallow poison, but she nodded reluctantly. Second, you will apologize to Mrs. Martinez, Mrs. Patterson, and any other neighbors you've harassed over the years. Face to face, acknowledging the harm you've caused. But third, David continued relentlessly, you will cease all harassment of your neighbors. No more false police reports, no more frivolous complaints to the city, no more intimidation or verbal abuse. If I receive even one complaint about you continuing this pattern of behavior, I will personally review every report you've filed in the past 5 years and pursue charges for each false claim. The terms of surrender were clear and non-negotiable. Helen stood there for a long moment, her carefully constructed world of petty power crumbling around her. She could accept these conditions and retain some shred of dignity, or she could continue fighting and face the full legal consequences of her actions. And fourth, David added, his voice softening slightly, I strongly recommend you seek counseling. This level of sustained harassment suggests some underlying issues that professional help might address. The suggestion was delivered with genuine concern rather than malice, and somehow that made it more devastating than any threat. It acknowledged what everyone on Maple Street had known for years but never. Helen Thornfield stood at the crossroads of her own making, the weight of 37 years of accumulated cruelty pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. The morning that had begun with such vindictive promise, catching her Hispanic neighbor in an act she could twist into criminality, had transformed into her own public trial, with a jury of the very people she'd spent decades tormenting. I need a moment, she whispered, her voice barely audible. This is a lot to process. But Elena Martinez wasn't finished. The floodgates of her suppressed anger had opened, and 20 years of injustice poured out in a torrent of memories that painted Helen's true character in stark, undeniable colors. You want to know what kind of person she really is, Sheriff? Elena stepped closer to the fence, her small frame vibrating with righteous fury. When my mother was dying of cancer 3 years ago, she came to stay with us for her final weeks. This woman," she pointed an accusing finger at Helen, "called the city health department, claiming we were running an illegal boarding house. She tried to force a dying woman out of her daughter's home." The revelation hit the gathering like a physical blow. Even Mrs. Patterson gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Marcus felt his stomach turn at the depths of Helen's cruelty, using bureaucracy as a weapon against a family caring for their dying matriarch. "That's not." "I didn't know she was dying," Helen stammered, but her words rang hollow. "You knew," Elena shot back. "I told you when you complained about the extra car in our driveway. I begged you to have some compassion, told you she had maybe weeks left. And you looked me in the eye and said, 'That's not my problem. Rules are rules.'" David's expression had grown darker with each revelation. As a law enforcement officer, he'd seen humanity at its worst, but there was something particularly insidious about Helen's systematic campaign of cruelty disguised as civic duty. "Mrs. Martinez," he said gently, "I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry you had to endure that harassment during such a difficult time." Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face. "My mother died hearing that woman screaming at city inspectors outside our house, demanding they remove the illegal occupant. Her last weeks should have been peaceful, but instead she worried she was a burden, that she was causing us trouble." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the distant sounds of suburban life, lawnmowers, children playing, dogs barking, seemed to fade into nothing. Helen's face had gone completely white, and Marcus could see her hands trembling as the full weight of her actions crashed down on her. I didn't mean." Helen's voice cracked, and for the first time since Marcus had known her, she looked genuinely human, fragile, broken, ashamed. "Yes, you did," Mrs. Patterson said quietly from behind her walker. "You meant every bit of it, Helen. You've always meant it. You drove my Harold to an early grave with your constant harassment. The stress of dealing with you contributed to his heart attack. The doctor said so." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Marcus had never heard about Mr. Patterson's death being connected to Helen's harassment, but, looking at the old woman's face, he could see the truth of it written in every line of grief and anger. "Harold was the kindest man who ever lived," Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice gaining strength. "He built that garden shed because I wanted to store my late father's tools somewhere safe. You turned it into a 2-year legal battle that cost us thousands of dollars and gave my husband panic attacks every time he saw you in the yard." Helen's legs finally gave out, and she sank down onto the ornate garden bench she'd placed strategically near the fence, positioned, Marcus now realized, for optimal surveillance of her neighbor's activities. Her perfectly styled silver hair had come loose from its bun, and her white cardigan was stained with dirt from gripping the fence. I was trying to maintain standards," she whispered, but the words sounded like a prayer rather than a defense, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. "Standards." Mrs. Patterson's voice rose to a pitch that could have shattered glass. "You called the police on the Henderson boy for selling lemonade without a permit. He was 8 years old, Helen. 8 years old, trying to earn money for a bicycle, and you traumatized him with threats of arrest." Marcus remembered the Henderson family, a young couple who'd lived in the house before he moved in. He'd heard whispers about why they'd left so suddenly, selling their home below market value, but he'd never understood the full story until now. "The boy started having nightmares," Mrs. Patterson continued relentlessly. "Stopped talking to his friends, refused to play outside. His parents spent thousands on therapy trying to undo the damage you caused. They had to move away just to help their child feel safe again." David was taking notes now, his pen moving steadily across the page as the catalogue of Helen's cruelties expanded. Each revelation added another layer to the pattern of harassment, painting a picture of systematic psychological warfare waged against an entire neighborhood. "Mrs. Thornfield," David said, his voice taking on the formal tone of official questioning, "these are serious allegations. Harassment, filing false reports, potentially contributing to someone's death through sustained psychological stress. These aren't minor infractions." Helen looked up at him with desperate eyes, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "You're his brother, aren't you?" she whispered. "Marcus Rivera's brother. That's why you're doing this." The accusation of bias, her last desperate attempt to shift blame, fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. David didn't even dignify it. With a direct response, My relationship to Mr. Rivera doesn't change the facts. It doesn't change the documented complaints you filed, the witnesses who've testified to your behavior, or the false statements you made this morning." He closed his notepad with a decisive snap. "In fact, if anything, knowing Marcus personally makes your false accusations even more serious, because I can testify firsthand to his character and the complete fabrication of your claims." The trap Helen had set for Marcus had become her own snare. By calling the police with false accusations of violence and drug use, she'd committed crimes that were now documented by the very system she'd tried to weaponize. Her assumption that a Hispanic man's word wouldn't be trusted over hers had blown up spectacularly when the responding officer turned out to be that man's brother, a respected law enforcement professional who'd spent 15 years building a reputation for integrity and fairness. "I want to make this right," Helen said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to apologize." The words sounded strange coming from her lips, as if she was speaking a foreign language. Marcus studied her face, trying to determine if this was genuine remorse or another manipulation, a tactical retreat designed to minimize consequences. "To everyone," she continued, looking around at the faces of her neighbors with something that might have been genuine shame. "I want to apologize to everyone I've hurt." Elena Martinez crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. "Words are easy, Mrs. Thornfield. You've spent 20 years proving that actions matter more than words." "Then tell me what actions you want," Helen said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Tell me how to fix this." The question hung in the morning air like a challenge. For decades, Helen had held all the power in this neighborhood dynamic, the power to call authorities, to file complaints, to make life miserable for anyone who didn't meet her impossible standards. Now, suddenly, that power had shifted to her victims, and she was begging them to show her the mercy she'd never shown anyone else. Marcus found himself studying this broken woman who had made his life hell for 6 months. She looked smaller, now, diminished by the weight of her exposed cruelties. The rage he'd carried, the anger that had sustained him through months of harassment, was transforming into something more complex, pity, perhaps, or the kind of sad understanding that comes from seeing someone destroy themselves through their own hatred. His mother's roses, still half planted in the garden bed behind him, seemed to whisper with Maria Rivera's voice, "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, mijo. But it means not letting their poison become yours. The first thing you need to do," Elena said, her voice steady and strong, "is understand that this isn't about you anymore. This is about the damage you've caused and whether you're actually willing to do the hard work of making amends." Helen nodded eagerly, like a drowning woman grasping at any offered rope. "The second thing," Elena continued, "is that your apologies need to be specific. Not 'I'm sorry if I hurt anyone,' 'I'm sorry you feel that way.' You need to acknowledge exactly what you did wrong and take full responsibility for it." Marcus watched this exchange with fascination. Elena Martinez, who had been terrorized and silenced for 20 years, was now setting the terms for Helen's redemption. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that Helen, the neighborhood's self-appointed queen, was now a supplicant begging for forgiveness from the people she'd considered beneath her notice. "And the third thing," Elena said, her voice softening slightly, "is that you need to get help. Professional help. Because what you've done to this neighborhood isn't normal, Mrs. Thornfield. It's not just being particular or maintaining standards. It's systematic cruelty, and until you understand." Marcus Rivera knelt beside his mother's roses one final time that morning, his hands working the rich earth while the drama of justice and redemption played out behind him. The Queen Elizabeth rose bush had waited patiently through the chaos, its roots seeking purchase in soil that had become sacred ground, not just for his mother's memory, but for something larger. A place where truth had finally conquered lies, where the powerless had found their voices, and where even the most broken among them might find a path to healing. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said quietly, not turning around as he pressed the last of the soil around the rose's base. "My mother always said that gardens teach us about second chances. Every spring, even the most damaged plants get an opportunity to bloom again, if they're willing to do the work of growing." Helen looked up from her bench, her tear-stained face etched with confusion and something that might have been hope. "I don't understand." Marcus stood slowly, brushing the dirt from his hands, the same hands Helen had claimed were wielding weapons just an hour earlier. When he turned to face her, his expression held no anger, no triumph, only the quiet dignity that had sustained him through months of harassment. She also said that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what someone did to you. It's about refusing to let their poison become yours. He gestured toward the freshly planted rose. I could spend the rest of my life hating you for trying to destroy something beautiful, or I can choose to build something better. David watched his brother with undisguised admiration. In all their years growing up, Marcus had been the steady one, the peacemaker who could find common ground between enemies. But this went beyond diplomacy. This was moral courage of the highest order. Mr. Rivera, Helen whispered, her voice breaking. I don't deserve your kindness. Not after what I've done. No, Marcus agreed simply. You don't. None of us deserve the grace we are given. But that's what makes it grace. Elena Martinez studied Marcus with new respect. She'd been prepared. For anger, for demands for justice and retribution. The last thing she'd expected was this quiet offer of redemption to the woman who had made their lives hell. However, Marcus continued, his voice taking on a firmer tone, grace doesn't mean there are no consequences. It means the consequences serve a purpose beyond punishment. He looked around at the assembled neighbors, Elena with her arms still, crossed but her expression thoughtful, Mrs. Patterson leaning heavily on her walker but standing straighter than she had in years, the Johnson family still watching from their window but no longer hiding in fear. Mrs. Thornfield, you've spent decades trying to control this neighborhood through fear and intimidation. You've weaponized the very systems that are supposed to protect us, turned them against innocent people because they didn't fit your vision of who belonged here. His voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. That ends today. Helen nodded frantically. Yes, I understand. I'll stop. I promise I'll stop. Stopping isn't enough, Elena interjected, her voice sharp. Stopping is what you should have done 20 years ago. Now you need to make amends. David stepped forward, his notepad open again. Mrs. Thornfield, here's what's going to happen. You're going to write formal apologies to every family you've harassed, not just the ones here today, but everyone you can remember filing complaints against. The Hendersons, the Kowalskis, the Patel family who lived at 1243 before the Johnsons. All of them. But some of them have moved away, Helen protested weakly. Then you'll find them, David said firmly. You managed to track down obscure city ordinances to use against them. You can manage to track down addresses to apologize to them. And it won't be some generic I'm sorry letter, Elena added. You'll be specific about what you did to each family, acknowledge the harm you caused, and take full responsibility without excuses or justifications. Helen's face crumpled as the magnitude of her task became clear. Decades of cruelty would require decades of amends, each one a specific reckoning with the pain she'd inflicted. Furthermore, David continued, you'll make financial restitution where appropriate. The Hendersons' therapy bills for their son, the legal fees families incurred fighting your frivolous complaints, the loss the Kowalskis took when they sold their house below market value to escape your harassment. I don't have that kind of money, Helen said desperately. Then you'll work out payment plans, Mrs. Patterson said firmly, speaking up for the first time in the discussion of terms. You'll sell things if you have to. That fancy car in your driveway, some of your antiques. You managed to find money for surveys and legal fees when you were attacking us. You'll find money to repair the damage you caused. Marcus watched this negotiation with fascination. His neighbors, people who had been cowering in fear of Helen Thornfield just hours earlier, were now dictating terms to their former tormentor with the confidence of people who had finally found their power. And therapy, Elena added. Professional. Counseling to figure out why you've spent your life hurting people. Not just anger management, but real therapy to address whatever made you think this behavior was acceptable. Weekly sessions, David specified. For at least a year, with proof of attendance submitted to the Sheriff's Department monthly. Helen nodded numbly at each requirement, the weight of actual accountability settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. For someone who had never faced real consequences for her actions, the prospect of systematic amends was overwhelming. There's one more thing, Marcus said quietly, and everyone turned to look at him. Mrs. Thornfield, you're going to help me finish my mother's garden. The suggestion sent shock waves through the gathering. Even David looked startled by his brother's proposal. What? Helen whispered. Every Saturday morning for the next 6 months, you're going to come over here and help me plant, weed, water, and tend this garden. You're going to learn the names of every flower, understand what each one needs to thrive, and participate in creating something beautiful instead of destroying it. Helen stared at him as if he'd suggested they fly to the moon together. I don't understand. Why would you want that? Marcus gestured toward the rose bush, now secure in its new home. Because gardens teach patience, Mrs. Thornfield. They teach humility. You can't force a plant to grow faster than it's ready to. They teach care for living things, responsibility for nurturing rather than destroying. He met her eyes directly. And they teach that even the most damaged soil can support new life if you're willing to do the work. The metaphor hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and transformative. Elena looked between Marcus and Helen with dawning understanding. He's offering you a chance to learn how to be human again, she said softly to Helen. Don't waste it. David closed his notepad with a decisive snap. Mrs. Thornfield, you have a choice. Accept these terms: the apologies, the restitution, the therapy, the community service in Mr. Rivera's garden, and we'll consider this matter resolved without criminal charges. Refuse, or fail to follow through, and I'll be back with arrest, warrants for filing false police reports, harassment, and whatever other charges I can make stick. Helen looked around at the faces surrounding her, the neighbors she had terrorized, the sheriff who held her fate in his hands, and the man she had tried to destroy who was offering her redemption through dirt and flowers. I accept, she whispered. I accept all of it. The words fell into the morning air like seeds finding soil. Not an ending, but a beginning, the first tentative steps toward healing wounds that had festered for decades. Good, David said simply. I'll check back in a week to see how you're doing with those apology letters. Mrs. Martinez, Mrs. Patterson, if you have any problems with Mrs. Thornfield in the meantime, you call me directly. He handed them each his business card. And Mrs. Thornfield, remember, this is your one and only chance. Don't squander it. As the crowd began to disperse, neighbors returning to their homes with something that felt like peace settling over Maple Street for the first time in decades, Marcus found himself alone with Helen beside his mother's garden. Mr. Rivera, she said hesitantly, I need to ask you something. Why? Why give me this chance when I tried so hard to hurt you? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the wooden handle of his shovel. When he spoke, his voice carried the wisdom of someone who had learned that forgiveness was not weakness, but the strongest choice a human being could make. Because my mother believed that everyone deserves a chance to become the person they were meant to be before life broke them, he said. She believed that hatred was a poison that destroyed the vessel that contained it more than its intended target. And she believed that gardens, like people, could be redeemed with enough love, patience, and honest work. He looked at Helen, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time, not as a monster or an enemy, but as a damaged woman who had spent decades drowning in her own bitterness. Besides, he added with the ghost of a smile, she always said the best fertilizer for roses was bullshit. You've certainly provided plenty of that. Despite everything, Helen almost smiled at the gentle profanity. It was the first genuine expression Marcus had ever seen on her face, and it transformed her completely, revealing glimpses of the person she might have been if she hadn't chosen to weaponize her pain against the world.